Welcome. We're really lucky to have Michael Kremer, who's one of the pioneers of doing randomized controlled trials in development economics, talking about how experiments have turned into an incredibly powerful tool for learning all kinds of things that are useful for making better policy. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
I remember actually almost exactly the day when we first time talked about randomized controlled trials. We're standing outside my office, and you were kind of slightly, I think, disturbed by the fact that somebody had spent $40,000 buying a SUV so that they could collect data. And you said, $40,000. With $40,000, we could do an experiment and generate the data. And I remember that line. So I guess randomized controlled trials have come a long way from there. Did you expect them to come this far when this conversation? Was this just a reaction to, that kind of maybe that use of the money and thinking of what else you could do? Did you have a sense of where it would end up?
Well, I got involved in randomized controlled trials. I taught secondary school in Kenya, as you know, and that was before graduate school, and then after becoming a junior faculty member, I could then afford to go back on vacation to Kenya, and I looked up some of my friends, and one of them was now working for an NGO, and his job was to go to an area of Kenya where that NGO had not worked before and find 7 schools in which to work. And so I just suggested to him, and I think at the time I just thought this would be this was not something that was done very much, and I didn't think he would even say yes, let alone that this would take off. But I said, if you wanted to learn about the impact of what your NGO is doing, perhaps you could choose 14 schools that met your criteria, and then choose 7 and start there, and then as you expand, maybe go on to some of the others. And to my surprise, he said, yes, and that sounds like a good idea. I'll talk to my boss about it. And then I went home from my vacation, and I then got a call saying that the boss was interested in it as well, and so got on a plane again, went back to Kenya, and they decided that they wanted to do this. And then after that, they started out doing their standard program, which they had done before in other areas. But the results on that were not necessarily what they were hoping for. And the leader of this NGO was actually very open and said, let's try some other things. And so they, over time, this was, I think, 94 when I was first got involved with them. I talked to them about what looked promising based on some of the non-experimental evidence, and they thought about what things they wanted to try. They tried a number of different things, and they got in the habit of introducing, at least randomizing the order in which things were phased in order to systematically find out which approaches were more successful. So that's how this started. And you're right, it started with very small amounts of money and tiny number of schools, just 7 schools, not really enough to have a lot of precision in the estimates. But over time, this really took off, and many people got involved in doing this type of research, and I'm delighted about that.
I, in fact, remember also the number $40,000 also sticks in my mind because it was the budget of the first RCT that I was involved with. We were on it together in Udaipur. Again, budget was $40,000. Right. Why do RCTs cost more now? Where has the ambition expanded? I mean, I'm sure we are doing more with that money, but why does it cost more?
I think the sample sizes have expanded. The number of outcomes that people are conducting have expanded. I think many of the so I think I would actually draw a distinction. There are some RCTs that were done that cost a very large amount of money, and that was governments doing RCTs of programs that they were about to implement. And so there's some examples of that in the US in the 1970s. A very important example of that in development is conditional cash transfers that Mexico did. And I think what was what's different about the new wave of evaluations is there are often collaborations between academics and NGOs, and NGOs are able to try lots of different things. And so you often have multiple arms, and the NGO is able to learn in real time about what's going on, and the researchers are able to learn. And then often there's a series of evaluations, and by putting together all those evaluations over time, you can build up a much more comprehensive picture of what works and what doesn't work in a certain area. And to the extent that you've got academics involved, and I don't want to take away credit from the implementers either, you're often able to build up not just an understanding of what the impact of a particular evaluation is, but insights into the broader patterns in the data. Partly because you're trying more options, partly because there's opportunity for trying to design, not just there's a very large government program already designed, we're going to evaluate just that program, but rather there can be dialogue between the academics and the NGO about how can we design this so that we are investigating creative new ideas and in a way that will allow us to shape the program and shape the area, whether it's education or water or health or savings in the future.
Do you want to give us, our viewers, an example of this kind of interactive learning process?
So here's an example in the area of water. So there was the same NGO was involved in some water projects, and they were looking at a particular technology, which was there are naturally occurring springs in Western Kenya, but those springs often have contamination, fecal contamination. And so they said, well, let's try to put some concrete around, we'll excavate what's called the eye of the spring, put a pipe in there, put some concrete around, and that protects the spring from fecal contamination, at least partially. So we evaluated the impact of that, and we saw, on the one hand, there was a reduction in fecal contamination, E. coli bacteria at the source. On the other hand, and there was in fact some reduction in diarrhea. But when we looked at the reduction in E. coli bacteria where people were actually storing the water in their homes, we saw that it was very modest relative to the reduction at the source. And what was happening was the water was getting recontaminated in transport and in storage. So learning from that, we were able to try some different ideas. So there's learning in the policy direction. I'll tell you about that in a second. But there's also, I think, an example of learning that was perhaps more in the academic direction, that was not something that we had initially thought was going to be coming from this. But we noticed that people were willing to switch water sources to go to one of these protected springs. And they weren't necessarily, they weren't willing to walk much further to get to a protected spring, but they were willing to walk at least a little bit further. So it turns out that you can use some techniques in economics, what's called travel cost economics, to estimate how much extra value they put on that water. Then using that, you could actually simulate the effects of different property rights systems for water. And this question of property rights and what's the impact of different property rights systems is not something that we initially thought about with this, but it's a very big question in economics. There's often a feeling that it's best to have strong property rights, by which people mean private property rights. And if you thought about, to take the water context, the different people have springs on their land, and these springs are traditionally, they're open for common use. You have to let your neighbors use these. And in fact, when the British colonial state came, they reinforced these rules. They kept those rules. And then when the independent government of Kenya came, they also kept these rules. Now you might say as an economist, well, if we had private property, then people might have an incentive to protect the springs themselves. And then, because if you have to let the neighbors use it for free, you're not going to be able to recover the cost of doing the work on this. So we were in position, by estimating how much people valued this improved water, we could say, well, suppose that you did have private property. Would people be able to make back the cost of installing this? Would they find it privately profitable to do it? And what might be the other costs of the other impacts of a private property system? Well, it turns out that when we estimated this, and this requires obviously more assumptions than are required for the simple impact, what's the impact of the protected spring versus what's the on diarrhea versus an unprotected spring. But with some additional assumptions, you can estimate what the impact would be of private property rights. And it turns out that it would be disastrous, that there'd be very, very few landowners with the spring would find it profitable to actually protect their spring. But if they could charge, people would walk further to get to a source that's not on private property. They'd go to a lake or to a river. Well, these are both dirtier sources and they're farther away. So people would be walking further to get dirtier water. And the cost to society would actually be very large. So it turned out that the traditional laws and norms actually seem to have made a lot of sense for this context. It doesn't mean that they're the best situation you can be in. The best situation would be to find some other way of cleaning the water, but private property rights probably isn't going to do it, at least in Kenya right now. Perhaps in other societies, higher income levels, this would work well. So that's the insight that we got from the theory. There was also this very practical observation we found that the water was getting recontaminated. So taking the insights from both of those together, we then started to examine, the NGO decided it was interested in, and we started to examine an alternative approach, which was just treating the water. Because it turns out that water can be treated with chlorine. Most of the water that is drunk in rich countries is treated with chlorine. And that is very effective against the organisms that cause diarrhea. Diarrhea kills, estimates vary, but maybe 1 million kids a year, or more, depending on how you count it, worldwide. So we then experimented with their chlorine solution is already, you can buy it for camping. Those of you who go camping may be familiar with this. It's also available in many developing countries. It's sold for about 30 cents for a month's supply. That might not seem very much, but it turns out that was enough to prevent the majority of households from using this. In fact, take-up is usually in the single digits. So we looked at a whole variety of different approaches to increasing take-up. One of the things we found was that price was one of the most important factors. And other work suggests that convenience might be important. And we experimented with an approach of just having a large container of dilute chlorine solution at the water point with a tap so that you can measure out the right amount for the typical 20-liter container with which people collect water. So it turned out that approach was very successful in getting high uptake. And we think that some of the reasons are it's free, it's very convenient, it helps form habits because rather than you bring the kid, you go get your water, you bring the water home, your kid's crying, you're looking for the bottle top, measuring out the right amount, pouring it in. There's a certain time each day when you go collect your water and you get a visual cue. There's a dispenser right there. There's a reminder to do this, and there's a particular time each day when it would be natural to do it. It's also the case that there are other people around. You can see whether they used it. You can talk to people about it. Maybe also the fact that they can see whether you use it helps build a social norm. So this got the majority of people using chlorine. And this approach was very inexpensive, and it's now been various NGOs are working to scale this up. It's now reaching 1 million people in Kenya have access to this, and it's being piloted in other countries as well. So this is an example where through a series of experiments, through a series of program evaluations, there was an opportunity to learn, to innovate in ways that were not originally on the radar screen, and to also learn academically about some larger questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right. That was, as I expected, wide-ranging and exciting. And I'm sure there'll be many more such exciting experiments that you'll be part of and we'll hear of later.
Great. Thank you very much.